by the book of their deeds, the book of their words, and the book of their art. And like Ruskin, Clarke felt that only the last, the book of art, could be trusted. And I put this rather romantic notion to broadcaster and critic Phillip Adams.
I think it is a very romantic notion, and what troubles me is how Lord Ken reads the arts. I think that his is an intensely Eurocentric view. In fact, it's the view of a London clubman. It's how you see civilization from your large leather armchair at White's or the Garrick. He turns a blind eye, I think, to the Muslim contribution, for example. In the first episode, he is incredibly dismissive of any Muslim contribution to the culture of Europe. And he also, I think, well, look, this is what he does. In the first ep, he stands against a background of, I think, Notre Dame in Paris, looking wonderful in his German street clothing. And he says, you know, we almost lost all this. We almost lost the great European civilization. It was almost destroyed. Now, Peter, I assumed he's about to make a reference to Holocaust, for example, or to the reoccurring catastrophes in the Balkans. But no. He was talking about those awful dark people who sort of rode up the Seine in a longboat. He's talking, in other words, about attacks on Europe by non-Europeans, and he completely forgets that again and again and again European culture has been destroyed by Europeans. It's a remarkably narrow view. In fact, it'll be rather interesting today to discuss the behaviour of his son. You know that he's in a little bit of bother, Lord Clarke's son, and his wife said something to the effect, oh, well, if you bed people from below stairs, that's what you have to expect. They go to the tabloids. Not that Lord Clarke would ever have gone to the tabloids, but he has an above and below stairs attitude to civilization. And the people who are below stairs are the Egyptians, for example, who don't even get a passing mention, and anyone who is not European and Christian. Now, he's dazzlingly articulate, isn't he? I mean, the words come tumbling out. And you made an observation to me privately that he's not using autocue. This is a guy thinking on his feet. Wonderful. But he couldn't get away with saying most of those things. Now, he'd be torn apart by modern scholars who would actually suggest to him that people whose skins were darker had a contribution to make to civilization.
Well, of course, as a grandee, he doesn't look to scholars for reinforcement of his thesis. He just knows, doesn't he?
Yes, but he knows. Look, the classical Greek civilization is in a sense an extension of Oxford and Cambridge. It's somewhere between Oxford and Harrods, and that's where he positions it. And if it's outside those terms of reference, he is, I think, very dismissive. It is a deeply offensive thing, for example, to talk of the Dark Ages without putting it in quote marks, as though nothing happened for a few hundred years. But of course that was a time of great Muslim scholarship. It was when that part of the world was in fact preserving culture, while Christians had a dark age. So again and again he drops clangers. Now he talks about going back to the record of buildings. He's not really interested in how ordinary people lived. You can't judge great societies by a few remaining temples stuck up around the place. It'd be like judging Australian society by a couple of skyscrapers down at the quay, wouldn't it? So he doesn't really address what was going on with ordinary people. It's the great ruins that have been left behind that fascinate him. Now, you can't take away his breadth and his amazing ability with words, but he is blind, I think, to so many issues that these days would have to be factored into a discussion on civilization.
Do you think it's perhaps irresponsible of us to be playing it again as though it's a freshly minted exercise?
No, I don't, because it is extraordinarily interesting as an archaeological piece in its own right. To realise that whilst the buildings he's discussing haven't changed much in the last 20 years, the attitudes to them have changed so enormously. I think the value of it is that it allows people to discuss this Eurocentric and Christian view. And I believe that probably the net effect of it is going to be to help scholarship rather than to hurt it, because people will ricochet off him and go to the arguments, say, of Black Genesis, which are now, of course, are coming through very powerfully. I find it still enchanting to view. And of course, what it was the second great BBC series, wasn't it, after the Great War? So it's Lord Reithian television, isn't it? This is what television is meant to do. It's meant to educate as well as entertain.
Yes, and it's sort of ex cathedra.
You know what he reminds me of is of one of those Galapagos turtles. He actually looks like one. That bony forehead and the nose stuck out on that long, scrawny neck. But these days he would need the carapace of a Galapagos turtle to survive the attacks on him. He's lucky to be dead. I mean, if he wasn't, he'd be in more trouble than his son.
Okay, suppose we were producing Civilisation 1994 and Phillip Adams was the host. Where would it start for you?
Well, you'd crank it back a bit. I think most scholars would now acknowledge that whilst the Greeks were a great lightning conductor of civilization, they didn't invent it. That a lot of things happened across the pond. A lot of things came out of Africa, and particularly out of the great cultures, the great civilizations, dare I suggest, on the other side of the Mediterranean. So there would certainly be an admission that black Africa had something to contribute to civilization. He might also have been intrigued to discover, as we've all discovered recently, that the oldest artworks on Earth have been found in Australia. So the whole notion of Europe as being central to the development of human culture, of civilization, is now under great scrutiny. So you'd have to cast a wider net. You'd have to be inclusive rather than exclusive. And it is the exclusive nature of the tone of voice and of the attitudes which I think really sets him in his own time.
Of course, Sir Kenneth Clarke measures civilization by stones, by great monuments, great architecture, artifacts, and so on. But it doesn't matter how great your art if you don't behave yourself.
Isn't it an irony that the country which arguably took European civilization to its highest form, Germany, was then capable of taking civilization to its lowest ebb? You know, the country of Beethoven and Goethe, etc., gave us the Holocaust. So it's not sufficient, I think, to measure history in terms of bricks and mortar. Things were going on in those buildings. Ideas were being expressed. And a very beautiful building can, in fact, be a tomb of great ideas or a place where horrible new ideas can fester. You see, if you go to Egypt, if you and I were to wander around the pyramids, we would see the signs, the vestigial traces of how ordinary people lived in mud brick. Mud brick doesn't last. Stone does. So you forget the people who lived in the mud brick. And all those cultures, the people who lived in the timber houses, there's no trace of them. This is the record of history as left by monuments and monoliths. And he's comfortable with that. Many people these days wouldn't be.
In the last episode, Kenneth Clarke makes this observation. Above all, I believe in the God-given genius of certain individuals, and I value a society that makes their existence possible.
Well, I'd have some trouble with God-given, but I take the thrust of his argument. But Peter, it's grossly incorrect politically. This is not PC. Political correctness has really disposed of the idea of the individual genius driving history. It's even demolished the canon, hasn't it, of great art. I think he's more right than wrong. But too many people are below stairs. Women, for instance, are entirely absent. Where are they, Peter? Are they out making scones for Michelangelo? They're doing whist drives to help repaint the Sistine. They do not exist in his worldview. But having said that, I'm deeply grateful for the ABC in digging them out of the archives, brushing the cobwebs off, blowing the dust off the videos, and whacking them on again, because they've been a tonic. But I do suggest that sometimes your viewers will be well advised to keep their fingers on the remote buttons, to turn off Sir Ken and just look at the things.
And you can hear Phillip Adams discussing the gamut of matters topical, historical and cultural on Late Night Live on ABC Radio National every Monday to Thursday at 10 past 10.